The boy would not sit still, and that was the problem that cracked everything open. 8-year-old Thomas Winslow had been pacing the length of the front porch for 20 minutes, his boots scuffing the warped planks, his small hands balled into fists at his sides, and his jaw set in the same stubborn angle his father had carried before a fever took him 3 winters ago. Maria watched her son from the kitchen doorway, a dish rag twisted between her hands, her heart doing something painful in her chest that she could not name and did not have time to feel. The drifter was already in the yard. He had appeared at the gate that morning with nothing but a bedroll, a battered Remington on his hip, and eyes the color of storm clouds rolling in from the north. He said his name was Micah Barker and that he needed water and a few hours of rest, and Maria, who had learned the hard way that desperation wore many faces in the year 1878, had almost turned him away. Almost. But then Thomas had stomped off the porch in one of his rages, the kind that had been growing worse since the spring, and the boy had knocked over the fence post Maria had spent 2 hours driving into the hard Texas earth, and something in her had simply broken. She had stood there in the dust of her failing homestead on the outskirts of Redemption, Texas, and she had cried without making any sound at all, which was somehow the worst kind of crying. The drifter had watched all of this from the gate. He had not looked away the way most men did when a woman showed her grief. He had watched with those steady storm cloud eyes, and then he had done something she had not expected. He had walked into the yard, picked up the fence post, and driven it back into the ground with 3 precise blows of the mallet, using a technique that was so certain and so clean that Thomas had stopped his tantrum entirely and simply stared. Then Micah Barker had turned to the boy, and his voice, when it came, was low and direct and carried the kind of authority that asked nothing in return for itself. He said, "Sit down and I will teach you everything a man should know how to do." The silence that followed those words was the kind that changes things. Thomas had looked at his mother. Maria had looked at the drifter. The drifter had looked at neither of them, only pulled a second mallet from the leather strap on his pack and set it on the ground beside the fence post, an invitation, patient and undemanding. Thomas sat down. And right there, in the dust of a broken homestead in the brutal summer of 1878, something began that none of them had any map for, something dangerous and necessary, and though Maria would not have admitted it for anything in the world, something that felt, in its very first moment, like hope. She needed to understand who this man was. That was the thought that had kept her up the previous night, turning in the narrow bed she had shared with no one since James died, listening to the wind strip at the corners of the house. She needed to understand what dark past a man carried when he drifted into Texas with no forwarding address and no explanation, when his hands knew how to drive fence posts with the efficiency of a man who had spent years doing hard physical work, but his eyes carried the specific hollowness of a man who had lost something he was not going to talk about. She needed to understand his hidden motive, if he had one. Because in 1878, on a homestead 60 miles from the nearest town of any size, a woman alone with a child and 400 acres of struggling cotton could not afford to misread a stranger. But first she needed to feed him, because that was what you did, and Maria Winslow had been raised to be practical above everything else. She made cornbread and salt pork and strong coffee and brought it to the porch, where Micah Barker had settled on the step after spending the better part of the morning showing Thomas how to set fence posts correctly, how to test the soil depth with a rod before committing to a hole, how to use your body weight rather than your arm strength to drive the mallet, and how to walk the fence line and read the ground for places where the soil had shifted. Thomas had not thrown a single fit in 3 hours. He had not kicked anything or knocked anything over or yelled at the sky. He had just worked, doggedly and seriously, following the drifter's instructions with an attentiveness that made Maria's throat tighten, because she recognized what she was seeing. She was seeing her son receive something he had been starving for, something she had been unable to give him no matter how much she loved him. He was being taught. "Thank you for the food," Micah said, taking the plate without the overfamiliar ease that some men showed when a woman fed them, men who had learned to read a widow's kindness as a form of invitation. He accepted it the way you accept something that has been freely given, respectfully and without presumption. Maria sat in the chair across from him, which was unusual. She did not normally sit when there was work to be done, and there was always work to be done. But she sat because she had questions, and because she suspected that if she did not get them out now, she would talk herself out of asking them. "Where are you coming from?" she said. "East," he said. "That covers a lot of ground." "It does," he agreed. He ate steadily and without hurry. Thomas had collapsed in the yard near the newly posted fence and was drawing shapes in the dust with a stick, the particular quiet tiredness of a boy who has been genuinely useful and knows it. "Are you running from something?" Maria said, because she had never learned to approach a difficult thing from the side. Micah looked at her then, directly. His eyes were exactly the color she had thought, a gray-blue that suggested rain without being cold. "Most people who drift are running from something," he said. "Or they've already lost what they were running toward, and it amounts to the same. Which is it for you?" He took a long drink of coffee before he answered. "Both, maybe." That was more honesty than she had expected, and it threw her slightly. She had been prepared for a deflection or a lie, and his straightforwardness landed in her chest with unexpected weight. "I'm not looking for trouble," he said. "I'm not going to cause you any. I can see what you have here, and I can see what you're up against, and I have no designs on anything that belongs to you." "I didn't ask if you did," Maria said. "No," he said, "but you were thinking it." She couldn't argue with that. She was thinking it. "I can work for my keep," he said. "If you have work that needs doing, I won't stay longer than you want me to." Maria looked at her son in the yard, drawing his shapes in the dust, quieter and more settled than he had been in months, and she thought about the south fence that was still falling, and the cotton that needed the irrigation ditches cleared, and the roof over the linta that was developing a sag she didn't know how to address, and the simple fact that a woman and an 8-year-old boy were not sufficient to run 400 acres of anything. "I have work," she said. "Then I'll stay until you don't." It was not a romantic declaration. It was a practical statement made by a practical man. And Maria Winslow, who was herself nothing if not practical, took it exactly as it was offered and began building her understanding of Micah Barker from that foundation. What she learned came slowly, the way all real knowledge comes, in pieces and fragments gathered from the spaces between words rather than from the words themselves. He had been a scout. She learned this when she found him studying the terrain west of the property, with an attention to detail that went beyond what a farmer needed, reading the landscape the way a man reads a map he already knows. When she asked, he told her briefly that he had scouted for the Union Army during the war, which would make him somewhere in his early 30s now, and then for various surveying parties in the decade after. He did not explain why he had stopped. He was from Tennessee originally. She learned this from the way he said certain words, a remnant of rhythm that the road had worn down but not completely erased. He did not confirm it until the third week, when she mentioned that her grandmother had been born in Nashville, and something passed across his face that was too quick to catch. He had lost someone. She was certain of this without being able to point to a single piece of evidence. It was in the way he sometimes stopped in the middle of a task and went somewhere else briefly behind his eyes, the way a person goes back to a place they carry inside themselves. It was in the way he watched Thomas with an expression that was careful and warm and also, very quietly, painful. She did not ask about it. She recognized that some secrets were not kept out of deception, but out of the simple need to survive. Some things, when spoken aloud too early, lose the membrane that is keeping them from destroying the person who carries them. So she did not ask, and he did not tell, and they worked together through the burning Texas summer with the specific efficiency of two people who had both been through enough that they knew not to waste energy on pretense. The days had a rhythm. Micah was up before dawn, and by the time Maria came out to start the stove, he had already done the first round of the property, checked the fence line, watered the horses, and assessed whatever needed assessing. He reported to her at breakfast with the same directness he brought to everything, and she told him what the priorities were, and they divided the work. Thomas was his shadow from breakfast until supper. This was not something anyone had arranged. It simply happened, the way some things between children and grown men simply happen, some recognition in the boy of something he needed and some answering recognition in the man. Micah never spoke down to Thomas. He never simplified things. He explained the actual reasons behind every task, not just the how but the why, and Thomas absorbed it with an intensity that Maria found almost painful to watch, because it illuminated so clearly how hungry her son had been for exactly this. He taught Thomas to read a weather sky, watching the clouds and the wind direction together to gauge what was coming. He taught him to test soil for moisture content by feel, pressing his thumb into the earth and reading the response. He showed him how to care for a horse's hooves, how to check for stones and rot, how to wrap a cannon bone that was running hot. He showed him how to use a level when setting posts or beams, how to find true vertical with a plumb bob, how to cut wood along the grain to reduce splitting. One evening, Maria came to the barn door to call Thomas for supper, and found them both seated on upturned crates in the lamplight, and Micah was showing the boy a pocket compass, explaining how to take a bearing, how to triangulate position using two landmarks and the angle between them. Thomas was bent over the compass with his whole body, the way children give themselves entirely to learning when they feel safe. Maria stood in the doorway and did not call them. She watched for a moment that she would carry with her for a very long time. She went back inside and kept supper warm and said nothing about it. The trouble started in the 5th week, and it came from the direction she had been watching least. His name was Clyde Morrow, and he was the man who held the note on her land. She had borrowed money from him 2 years ago, after James died and the harvest that year was poor, and she was looking at the winter with nothing to feed herself and Thomas and no good options. Clyde Morrow had been the only lender in redemption who would extend credit to a widow without a male cosigner, and she had understood even then that he had done it not out of charity, but because he calculated that she would fail, and that her 400 acres would then belong to him at a fraction of what they were worth. She had not failed. She had worked the land with a ferocity that surprised everyone, including herself, and she had made 3 partial payments on the note, enough to demonstrate intent, not enough to make Clyde Morrow feel in any way threatened by the possibility that she might actually pay it off. He came riding in on a Tuesday afternoon in late August with 2 men who worked for him, and who wore their guns in the particular way that men wear them when the guns are a message. Maria was in the cotton field when she heard the horses. She straightened up, one hand shading her eyes, and watched them come down the lane with the particular rolling confidence of men who were not coming to negotiate. Micah had been clearing the irrigation ditch 50 yards north. She saw him stand as well, watching. Clyde Morrow dismounted without waiting to be invited, which was itself a statement. He was in his late 40s, a thick man with the kind of face that had once been handsome and had since settled into something harder. He wore a good suit and a bad smile. Maria, he said, which was itself an offense, being the first name without the title designed to remind her of the power differential. Mr. Morrow, she said, not giving him the same. I'm here about the note, he said. Payment was due on the 1st of the month. I know when the payment is due, she said. I have it. I was going to bring it in on Thursday. Well, I've saved you the ride, he said, smiling. But there's also the matter of the penalty interest. You see, I've had my lawyer review the terms of the note, and there's a clause in there about improvements made to the property during the loan period. Maria felt the trap before he finished explaining it. She had felt it the moment he opened his mouth, the way you feel the ground change under your foot a half-second before the earth gives way. Any improvements made to the property increase the assessed value, he said pleasantly. which under the original loan agreement triggers a revaluation, and the difference between the original assessed value and the current value is due immediately as additional collateral. That is not what that clause means, Maria said. Her voice was very steady, which was the only way she could make herself speak. That clause refers to improvements made by the lender to protect his interest, not improvements made by the borrower on her own property. My lawyer sees it differently, Clyde Morrow said. And there it was, the hidden motive. She had suspected from the beginning that he had lent her the money because he wanted the land. Now he had watched her improve it for 2 years, watched her work herself nearly to bone, and he was going to use the law as his instrument. How much? She said. He named a number that was so far beyond anything she could reach that she felt the blood leave her face. Micah had walked over from the ditch without hurry, arriving at the edge of the conversation as Morrow named the number. He stood beside Maria, not in front of her, and said nothing. Morrow looked at him. "Who are you?" "Micah Barker," Micah said. "I don't recall seeing you around," Morrow said, with the specific intonation that men use to communicate that they consider someone else's presence to be presumptuous. "I work here," Micah said. Morrow looked between Micah and Maria with an expression that managed to be both speculative and contemptuous, implying several things about the arrangement that were designed to humiliate. "I'm sure you do," he said. "I know a lawyer in San Antonio," Micah said. "A good one. He'd likely want to see the exact wording of that clause and the original assessment and the current assessment and the chain of events that prompted your revaluation." Something shifted in Morrow's eyes. Not fear exactly, but a recalibration. He had not expected this response from a man with trail dust on his boots. "You have until the end of the month," Morrow said, returning his attention to Maria. "After that, I'll be forced to act on the default clause." He rode away with his men, and Maria and Micah stood in the hot afternoon watching them go, and for a moment neither of them said anything. Thomas had appeared from somewhere and was standing slightly behind Micah, watching the riders with the focused attention of a boy who understood that something serious had just happened. "Do you actually know a lawyer in San Antonio?" Maria said. "I know of one," Micah said, which was technically true when I said it. She exhaled. It was not quite a laugh. "I don't have that kind of money, Micah." "I know," he said. "But that clause is bad law, and I suspect Morrow knows it too. He was testing to see if you'd fold. I don't have the money to fight him either." "Let me write to the lawyer," Micah said. "A letter costs a stamp." She looked at him. The sun was behind him and his face was in shadow, but she could see his expression, which was serious and certain in the way of a man who had made up his mind about something and was simply waiting for confirmation that you wanted it. "Why?" she said, and she meant it as a larger question than just the lawyer. She meant, why are you here? Why are you helping? What do you want from me that you haven't said? He understood the larger question. She could tell by the pause. "Because it's right," he said. "And because Thomas needs this place." He said Thomas, not you. Maria noticed this and it caught in her chest, and she turned away before he could see whatever was on her face. The letter went to San Antonio on the Thursday post, and in the meantime there was still the harvest to bring in, still the land to work, still the daily business of survival on the frontier that did not pause for legal threats or personal complications. September in Texas was its own kind of battle. The cotton had to come in before the weather shifted, and 400 acres with 3 pairs of hands was brutal, but they did it. They worked from before sunup to after sundown for 2 weeks, and Thomas worked alongside the adults with the seriousness of a boy who has been given something real to do and intends to do it. At night, Maria cooked and they ate together on the porch because the house held the heat of the day like a furnace, and Micah taught Thomas to read the stars, identifying the major constellations, explaining the navigational principles that sailors and scouts both used to find direction in the dark. One night, after Thomas had been put to bed and the porch was quiet and the stars were enormous over the flat Texas sky, Maria and Micah sat in the particular quiet of two people who have been working alongside each other long enough that the silence between them is no longer empty. "You had a son," Maria said. She had not planned to say it. The silence that followed was long enough that she thought he was going to refuse it. "Yes," he said. "What happened?" Another pause. The night wind moved through the cotton, a sound like the edge of something. "Fever," he said. "4 years ago, he was 6. He paused again. His mother went with him. She was already weakened from something else, and the fever finished what the other thing had started. Maria did not say she was sorry because it was too small. She sat with it, the way you sit with something that is too big for words. His name was Samuel, Micah said, and then he did not say anything else. They sat there in the Texas night, two people carrying the specific weight of loss that never becomes lighter, only more familiar, and the stars moved overhead in their ancient indifference, and something changed in the space between them. It was not a dramatic change. It was the quiet kind, the kind where a wall that you did not know existed becomes suddenly, gently, not there. The letter from San Antonio arrived 2 weeks later. The lawyer's name was Reginald Holt, and his response was thorough and confident. He confirmed Micah's reading of the clause. Morrow's interpretation was, in his professional opinion, either a deliberate misreading or a reflection of profound ignorance, and either way, it would not survive a challenge in court. He offered to handle the matter for a fee that was modest by the standards of his profession, and entirely beyond what Maria had. Micah appeared at breakfast that morning with the letter in his hand and a manner that suggested he had made a decision before she had a chance to weigh in on it. "I have some money saved," he said, "enough to cover Holt's fee and the payment you owe Morrow." Maria set down her coffee. "No, Maria, no," she said again. "I will not take your money, Micah. I won't be beholden to you on top of everyone else." "It's not charity," he said. "I'm not offering it as charity." "Then what are you offering it as?" He looked at her steadily. "As what it is, as something I want to do." "Why? You know why," he said. She did know. And it was precisely the knowing that made it so complicated. Because she could feel herself wanting to simply accept it, wanting to let someone help her, wanting to stop being the only one standing between her son and the world. And she had learned the hard way that wanting something that badly was a warning sign. "I barely know you," she said, though even as she said it she knew it was not true. She knew Micah Barker with the specific thoroughness of having worked beside a person in hard conditions, which is a more complete form of knowing than most people achieve after years of social acquaintance. "You know me," he said quietly. She looked away. Outside, Thomas was feeding the chickens with the particular focused efficiency that Micah had spent weeks instilling in him. "Alone," she said finally, "with interest. Written down and signed." "Fine," he said immediately, which told her he had expected this and had never intended to give her any less than the dignity of terms. They wrote it out at the kitchen table, 2 copies, signed and witnessed by themselves, and the seriousness of the document and the steadiness of his hand as he signed, it did something to Maria that she had not given herself permission to feel in 4 years. Reginald Holt was as good as his letter promised. He sent a formal response to Morrow's lawyer that was, by all accounts, devastating in its specificity. And within 10 days Morrow's lawyer sent a quiet communication indicating that his client would be withdrawing the revaluation claim and accepting the regular payment on the original terms. Clyde Morrow himself said nothing, which was its own form of answer. Men like Morrow did not pursue legal battles they could not win, because they understood that visibility in a lost cause cost more than the land itself. Maria made her payment, and the note was current, and Morrow's shadow retreated. That evening she cooked something that was not practical necessity but actual celebration: a roast chicken and sweet potato, and a cobbler from the peaches that had come in from the 2 trees by the south fence. And they ate at the kitchen table with a lamp burning. And Thomas talked the whole meal about what he had learned that day, and Micah listened with the attentiveness he always brought to Thomas, asking questions that took the boy seriously. And Maria sat across from Micah and watched him with her son, and felt something shift inside her like tectonic plates, slow and massive and irreversible. After Thomas was in bed and the dishes were done, she came out to the porch where Micah was sitting in the dark, and she sat down beside him on the step, closer than she usually would, and neither of them commented on the closeness. "You didn't have to do what you did," she said. "I know," he said, "but you did it anyway." "Yes." She turned to look at him. In the dark his profile was clean and certain, the same certainty he brought to everything, and she thought about how rare that was, actual certainty that was not rigidity, that was the kind of sureness that made room for other people. "Micah," she said. He turned to look at her, and in the dim light from the kitchen window his eyes were exactly the storm cloud gray she had catalogued on the very first day, and they held an expression that she recognized because she had been feeling it herself for weeks and trying very hard not to. She said, "Are you going to stay?" The question was larger than the word. They both understood that. "If you want me to," he said. "I'm asking what you want," she said. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I want to stay. I want to stay more than I've wanted anything in a long time, and that frightens me a little if I'm being honest." "Why does it frighten you?" "Because the last time I wanted something that much, I lost it," he said, "and I'm not sure I could survive losing something like this again." Maria felt the ache of that. She knew exactly what he meant, because she carried the same fear. James had not been gone so long that she had forgotten what it cost to love someone in a world that offered no guarantees. "I'm not asking you for a guarantee," she said. "I know," he said. She reached over and put her hand over his where it rested on his knee. His hand turned under hers and closed around it, and they sat like that in the dark Texas night, holding on, and it was not dramatic and it was not performed. It was just true, the way the best things are. October came and the air began to change, losing the brutal edge of summer and developing a sharp clarity that made the flat Texas land look like it had been cut from glass. The cotton was in, the fence line was repaired, the irrigation ditches were clear and properly graded, and the homestead looked, for the first time in Maria's memory of it, like a place that was going to survive. Micah had proved to be a man of extraordinary and varied competence, and this was not something that Maria had taken for granted. She had made a point of learning alongside him, asking questions, understanding the why behind each thing, because she understood that depending on his presence was a different thing than depending on his knowledge, and knowledge was something she could keep. He taught her things too, not just Thomas. He showed her how to read the weather markers that lived in the landscape itself, the way certain grasses bent before the wind, the way the sky at the western horizon turned a particular shade in the hour before a weather change. He explained the principles of the irrigation system he had redesigned, drew her a map of the water flow and where the pressure points were, and what to watch for. One afternoon she asked him to teach her to shoot more accurately. She had a rifle, a Winchester Model 1873 that she had owned since before James died, and she could fire it, but she could not fire it with the kind of precision that would be genuinely useful. Micah set up targets on the south fence and stood beside her and corrected her stance and her grip and her breathing, and his voice during these corrections was the same voice he used with Thomas, direct and patient, and without condescension. At one point he stepped behind her to adjust the angle of her elbow, and his hand was on her arm and she was aware of the warmth of it through her sleeve, and she focused very hard on the target. "Don't hold your breath," he said quietly. "Breathe out slow and squeeze between beats." She fired. The tin can 50 yards away rang and spun. "There," he said, and there was a pride in his voice that she felt. She handed him the rifle. "Your turn," she said. "Show me what right looks like." He raised the Winchester and fired 3 times in rapid succession, putting all 3 shots through a playing card she had pinned to the fence post, and then handed the rifle back with a restraint that told her he was deliberately not making a production of it. "You were a soldier," she said. "I was a scout," he said. "Scouts didn't fight from a line. They fought from wherever they were. Is that where you learned to be useful at everything?" He smiled at that, and it was the smile she had been collecting since the beginning, the rare one that reached his eyes and made him look younger. "My mother would have said I was useful at nothing except getting into trouble," he said. "Tell me about her," Maria said, because she had been gathering pieces of him and this was a piece she didn't have. He told her. His mother had been a schoolteacher in a small town in Tennessee, the kind of woman who believed with absolute conviction that education was the only thing that lasted. She had died of consumption when Micah was 17, and he had gone from her death into the army, which was where the war had found him. "She would have liked Thomas," he said. Maria stopped. That sentence, so simple, so specific, caught her completely off guard because it implied something about the future that he had never implied before. A continuity, a permanence, a them that included Thomas. "She would have," Maria said when she recovered. They walked back to the house in the afternoon light, not quite touching but close enough that the space between them was a kind of conversation. The first time he kissed her happened in November, and it happened without either of them planning it, the way the best kisses happen. They had been working together on the roof of the main house, replacing shingles that had finally given up after years of Texas weather, and they had come down the ladder just as the sun was touching the western horizon and painting everything that particular copper androse that the Texas sky does when it decides to remind you that the world is beautiful despite everything. Maria was at the bottom of the ladder. Micah came down behind her, and they both turned to look at the sunset at the same moment. The way you both turn to look at the same thing when you've been working side by side long enough that your attention naturally synchronizes. She said something about the color of the sky, something ordinary, and he turned to look at her instead of the sky, and she felt his gaze and turned to find him watching her with an expression that was so clear and so certain that there was no possible way to misread it. She did not look away. She met it. He raised his hand and touched her face, one thumb tracing the line of her cheekbone in a gesture of such careful tenderness that she felt it down to her sternum. And then he kissed her, slowly and surely, with the same quality of intention he brought to everything else in his life. She kissed him back, and the sunset was doing its extraordinary thing behind them, and Thomas, who was feeding the horses, did not see, and the world continued its business with the same indifference as always, and none of that mattered at all. When they broke apart, she was not sure how much time had passed. Some of the copper had gone out of the sky and the first stars were showing in the east. "I've been wanting to do that for a while," he said. "I know," she said. "Was that acceptable?" She laughed. Actually laughed, which was a sound she had not made often enough in 4 years and which felt like something long-locked opening. "Yes, Micah," she said. "That was acceptable." He smiled that real smile. "Good," he said simply. Thomas appeared from the barn with the particular timing of a child who senses that the adult world is doing something without him. He looked between them with the focused attention he brought to new information. "Are you two going to get married?" he asked. The directness of children in the presence of adult circumspection was the most effective force in the known universe. Maria and Micah both looked at the boy and then at each other, and Micah said with perfect seriousness, "That's a conversation your mother and I will have." Thomas appeared to find this satisfactory. He ran back toward the house, shouting that he was hungry, and Maria and Micah stood in the gathering dark and looked at each other with the specific mixture of amusement and gravity that only exists at moments where everything is about to become something more. The conversation happened 3 days later, over coffee at the kitchen table, with Thomas outside doing the morning chores Micah had established as his daily responsibility, a structure that Thomas had accepted so completely that he now policed himself. Micah said, "I'd like to ask you to marry me, but I want to be clear about what I'm asking." "Go on," Maria said. "I'm asking you to let me be here," he said, "not just to help. To be here in the way that means I'm always here, for the land and for Thomas and for you, particularly for you." "And what would you want from it?" she said. "You," he said simply, "and the chance to build something that doesn't end." She looked at him across the table. This man who had come into her yard with nothing but a bedroll and a direct gaze, and had spent 4 months rebuilding everything she had let fall into a state of desperate endurance. And she thought about all the reasons she should be careful, and all the things she did not know about him, and all the ways that need could be mistaken for love. And she thought about Samuel, his lost boy with the name she had heard only once but would never forget. She thought about the way he watched Thomas with that careful warmth. She thought about the night she had put her hand over his in the dark, and he had turned his palm and held on. "Yes," she said. He exhaled, and she understood from the quality of that exhale that he had not been certain of her answer, that the asking had cost him something real, and that the yes had given it back. "Yes," she said again more firmly. He stood up from the table and came to her side of it and drew her up by her hands and held her face between both his hands for a moment, looking at her with an expression of such transparent feeling that she had to look away and then back, because the directness of it was almost too much. He kissed her forehead and then her mouth and then held her against his chest, and she could hear his heartbeat, which was steady and strong the way he was, and she closed her eyes and let herself be held, which was something she had not let herself want or need for 4 years, and it was more of a relief than she had words for. Thomas's reaction when they told him was to be quiet for approximately 3 seconds and then say, "Does that mean you're going to be my father?" looking directly at Micah. Micah crouched down to Thomas's level. This was something he always did, getting to the boy's height before a serious conversation. "If you want me to be," he said. Thomas considered this with the gravity he brought to important decisions. "I would want that," he said, "but I need to tell you something." "What's that?" "I already call my real father Papa in my head," Thomas said, "so I can't call you that." "What would you like to call me?" Micah said. Thomas thought about it. "Micah," he said, "like now." "Because that's your actual name and you're an actual person." Micah smiled. "I think that's exactly right," he said. They were married in redemption in December of 1878, in the small Methodist church that was new enough that the wood still smelled like sawmill. The minister was a young man named Carver who had been in the territory for 6 months, and who performed the ceremony with an earnestness that Maria found both endearing and slightly exhausting. Micah wore his best shirt, which was clean and pressed, and the only visible concession to ceremony he had made, and Maria wore the blue dress she had made 2 years ago for Easter and had not worn since. Thomas stood between them at the altar with his hair combed flat, deeply serious, and when Carver asked if anyone had reason to object, Thomas appeared to physically prepare himself to deal with any objectors, which made Maria swallow a laugh during the most solemn moment of the service. There was no reception, because they had not told enough people to generate one, and what guests existed were 3 neighboring families who had become connected to Maria through the practical networks of frontier survival. They shook hands and offered good wishes and went home before the sun was fully gone, because December days were short and the road was long. Maria and Micah drove home in the wagon in the cold December dark with Thomas asleep between them, his head against Micah's arm, and the stars were brilliant, and the horses were steady, and Maria thought that she had never in her life felt so precisely in the right place. The first years of their marriage were not easy, because no years on a working Texas homestead were easy, but they were good in the specific way that things are good when the foundation is sound, and the people building on it know what they are doing and trust each other. Micah proved to be as committed in marriage as he had been in his initial declaration, entirely and without reservation. He was not a demonstrative man in the public sense, did not perform his feeling, did not need to be witnessed in it. But in the private sense, in the space of their life together, he was present in a way that Maria came to understand was extraordinary because it was so consistent. He did not have moods that punished the people around him. He did not withdraw when things were difficult. He faced problems with her, not at her or around her. He also continued to teach Thomas, which had always been the covenant between them, the original one, the one struck in the yard before any other thing. As the boy grew, he progressed from practical physical skills to more complex ones. Micah taught him to survey, using the basic equipment that a scout carried, how to map terrain, how to read a deed against the actual landscape. He taught him bookkeeping, sitting with him over the household ledgers and explaining what each column meant, what the numbers told you about the health of the enterprise. He taught him how to negotiate, which was perhaps the most unusual lesson. He explained to Thomas, in terms a boy could understand, and then, as the boy grew, in increasingly adult terms, the basic principles of persuasion and how to read the person across the table, what they actually wanted against what they said they wanted, how to find the overlap between their interest and yours and build the agreement there. Everything you'll ever need, Micah told Thomas when the boy was 12 and had successfully negotiated a trade with a neighboring farm, 2 of their extra laying hens for seed corn they needed, comes from understanding what the other person is actually trying to solve. Thomas had grown into a boy of remarkable self-possession, which Maria knew was not entirely her doing. She had kept him alive and loved him completely. But Micah had taught him how to be in the world, how to face it steadily and practically, and without pretending it was other than it was, and those were the skills that would carry him. In 1880, Maria found out she was expecting. She told Micah in the evening after Thomas was in bed, and the moment of telling was one of those moments that afterward seemed to exist slightly outside time. He had been at the table reviewing some notes he had been making about a proposed expansion of the irrigation system, and she sat down across from him and said, in her direct way, "I think we're going to have another child." He looked up from his papers and looked at her for a long moment. His face did not do anything theatrical. What it did was quiet, deeply and completely quiet, in the way of a man who is feeling something too significant for expression. He reached across the table and took her hand. "Are you well?" he asked. His first concern immediately was her. "I'm fine," she said. "Early days, but yes." He held her hand for a moment and then said quietly, "Maria." "I know," she said. "Samuel would have liked you," he said. She had not expected that, and she felt the tenderness of it all the way through. "Tell me about him," she said. She had asked before a little, but she had always waited for him to be ready. And he told her. He told her about Samuel, who had been a serious child with a quick laugh, who loved horses more than anything, who had started learning to read at 4 and had ambitions to know everything there was to know. He told her about Samuel's mother, Eleanor, who had been patient where he had been restless, soft where he had been hard, who had balanced him in ways he had not understood until she was gone. He talked for a long time, and Maria listened without interrupting, and some things that had been held closed in him for 4 years opened a little, and it was painful and necessary both. When he was done, he was quiet. "He would have liked Thomas too," he said. "Yes," Maria said. "I think they would have driven each other absolutely insane." Micah smiled, the real smile. "Yes," he said. Their son was born in the summer of 1880, and they named him James Micah Barker, the first name for Maria's first husband, which was a decision Micah had made and offered without any reservation whatsoever, because he was the kind of man who understood that honoring what came before was not a threat to what was present. James was from the beginning a different creature than Thomas. Where Thomas had been intense and contained and interior, James was entirely exterior, loud and physical, and in motion from the moment he could be. An explosion of personality that could fill a room and frequently filled the entire yard, and sometimes could be heard at the fence line. He was sunny and stubborn and enormously funny, and he attached himself to Thomas with a devotion that Thomas initially found inconvenient and eventually found to be one of the great anchors of his life. Micah loved James with the same quality of presence he brought to Thomas, which was not a small thing, because James tested that presence in entirely different ways. Thomas had needed patience and steady direction. James needed something more like a force of equal energy that could redirect without diminishing. And Micah found that too, that gear. and Maria watched him find it and felt a love for him that was so thorough it was almost impractical. The loan was paid off fully in the spring of 1882. Maria did the math herself, 3 times, and then brought the ledger to Micah and asked him to check it, and he confirmed it, and they sent the final payment to the bank in redemption with a letter from Maria that was polite and direct, and did not include a single unnecessary word. When the note came back marked paid in full, Maria hung it on the kitchen wall, which was not a sentimental thing she would normally have done. But Micah saw it there and said nothing about it, because he understood what it represented. Clyde Morrow had sold his lending business in 1881 and moved east, which was the most satisfying outcome possible. A man who had tried to use the law as a trap, discovering that the trap had better teeth than he had calculated. By 1883, the homestead was a going operation in every sense. The cotton fields were producing well. The irrigation system Micah had redesigned was proving its worth through the drought years, and they had added a small herd of cattle to the east acreage, which was a decision that had taken a year of careful discussion and planning, and which Thomas, now 13, had been deeply involved in. They had also, by this point, acquired the neighboring 120 acres to the north, purchased from a family that had decided the frontier was not for them. The expansion meant more work, but it also meant stability, and stability was what they had been building toward. In the evenings, after the work was done and supper was finished, and James had been wrestled into bed through his nightly campaign of resistance, and Thomas was reading in the lamplight in his room, Maria and Micah had the habit of sitting on the porch together in whatever weather presented itself. They talked about the land and the boys and what they needed and what they were planning, and sometimes they talked about other things, books they were reading, things they had heard in town, the state of the world beyond their fence line. It was on one of these evenings in 1883 that Micah told her something he had been carrying. Thomas, who was not supposed to be listening from his window, was listening from his window. "There's something I want to tell you," Micah said. Maria set down the mending she had been doing. Something in his tone organized her attention completely. "When I left Tennessee," he said, "after Alina and Samuel, I wasn't just drifting. I was looking for something." He paused. There was a man who had done business with Alina's father, crooked business, and Alina's family had lost almost everything to him. When the fever came, we couldn't afford the kind of care that might have made a difference. A real doctor, not a circuit rider. Maria was very still. "I spent 2 years finding him," Micah said. "I want you to know that." "And then," she said. "And then I found him," he said. "And I stood in front of him with my hands clear and my heart in the worst place it has ever been, and I made a choice." The silence stretched. "I walked away," he said, "because Samuel would not have wanted that for me. Because Alina would not have wanted that for me. Because I understood in that moment that I could spend the rest of my life feeding the thing that was eating me, or I could put it down." Maria exhaled slowly. "When did this happen?" "About 3 months before I came to your gate," he said. She absorbed this. She thought about the man who had appeared at her gate with bedroll and steady eyes and the specific hollowness of someone who had just made a very hard decision, and she understood him a little more completely. "And the man," she said, "is not my business anymore," Micah said, "and hasn't been since that day." She reached over and put her hand on his arm. "Thank you for telling me." "You deserve to know," he said. "I know you," she said. "I knew you that first week mostly. The rest has just been confirmation." He turned to look at her in the dark. "What did you know?" "That you were a good man," she said. "The kind that comes from suffering, not from never having been tested." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I love you, Maria." He said it simply, the way he said everything that mattered to him. "I love you," she said, completely and without any reservation whatsoever. They sat together in the dark, and the porch was quiet, and the land was dark around them, and the stars were doing their ancient thing overhead. And Thomas, listening from his window, understood that he had heard something important, something about the way adults carried their pasts and made choices about them, something that he would turn over in his mind for many years. The winter of 1884 was the hardest they had seen, a drought followed by a series of ice storms that were unusual for that part of Texas, and that tested the homestead and the family in every way. 3 of the cattle were lost to the cold, which was a material loss. The Northfield's irrigation system was damaged by the freeze, and repairing it in winter conditions was miserable work. But they did it. They worked through it with the specific competence of people who have been preparing for difficulty rather than hoping it won't come, and by spring the damage was repaired and the herd was rebuilt with 2 new calves, and the fields were ready. James, at 4, was enormously annoyed by the cold, which he expressed with great volume and creativity. He had opinions about winter that he shared with anyone who would listen, and since Thomas was his primary audience, Thomas spent a significant portion of that winter being lectured about the injustice of ice by a 4-year-old. Thomas, for his part, had developed in that winter into something recognizable as a young man. He was 14, nearly the height of Micah, with his father's coloring and his mother's eyes and a quality of steady attention that was entirely his own. He had begun helping Micah not as a student following a teacher, but as an actual working partner, making decisions and solving problems independently, checking in not for approval but for another perspective. One afternoon in March of that year, with the ice finally gone and the first real warmth coming back to the land, Micah came in from the north field and found Thomas working through a problem with the irrigation calculation, filling pages with figures, and he stood in the doorway watching his stepson for a long moment before Thomas looked up. "Something wrong?" Thomas said. "No," Micah said. "Just looking." "At what?" "At you," Micah said. "At who you've become." Thomas looked slightly uncomfortable, the way 14-year-old boys do when they are moved. "I had a good teacher," he said. "You had the material in you," Micah said. "I just helped you find it." Thomas was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Micah, the thing you told Mama last fall about the man you found." Micah looked at him steadily. "You heard that. It was not a question." "Yes," Thomas said without apology, because he had learned from both his parents that honesty was not negotiable. "I wasn't trying to listen, but I did. And I think you made the right choice," Thomas said. "And I think it was harder than it sounds." Micah looked at the boy and felt something in his chest that was complex and warm and particular. "Yes," he said, "it was." "I think," Thomas said carefully, working through the thought as he spoke, "that what you did by walking away from him was braver than what the other choice would have been, because the other choice would have been easy. It would have felt like power, but you already knew it wasn't." Micah sat down across from him. "Where did you get that?" "From you," Thomas said simply. "You've been teaching me that my whole life, just not in those words." They sat there across the table in the March light, the man and the boy who had found each other in a dusty yard because of a fence post and a mallet, and the thing between them was not performance and did not need to be spoken any more than it already had been. In 1885, Maria discovered she was expecting again, and this time it came with a complication she did not immediately share with Micah. She had been feeling unwell for longer than the early stages of a pregnancy typically lasted, and when the circuit doctor came through Redemption in April, she asked him about it with the directness she applied to everything. The doctor was not an alarmist, but he was honest, and he told her that the pregnancy was higher risk than her first 2 had been, that she would need to take more care than she had in previous years, and that certain work should be reduced significantly. She sat with this information for 3 days, turning it over, assessing it, deciding how to tell Micah. She told him on a Sunday evening, because Sunday was the one day the work stopped early enough that they were not both too tired for hard conversations. He listened to everything without interrupting, which was how he listened. Then he said, "What do you need?" Not what should we do, not how can we fix it, not a reorganization of everything around his own reaction. Just what do you need? She felt the love in that question so strongly that her eyes filled, which almost never happened anymore. "I need you to not treat me like I'm made of glass," she said. "I won't," he said, and I need the doctor's instructions to be followed without you making them into a constant reminder." "They will be," he said. "And I need you to keep talking to me the way you always do," she said, "like I'm your partner, not your patient." He reached across the table and took her hand. "Maria," he said, "you are my partner. You have always been my partner. That doesn't change because of a complication." She squeezed his hand. "Good," she said. Thomas took on more of the physical management of the homestead without being asked, which was the mark of how thoroughly he had been prepared. He coordinated with the neighboring families for help during the heaviest work periods, arranged a labor exchange that Micah had the bones of but Thomas executed entirely on his own, and he managed it all with a competence that made Maria quietly fierce with pride. James, at 5, did not fully understand what was happening, but understood that his mother needed careful treatment, which he interpreted as an opportunity to show her things he had made, explain to her at great length things he had learned, and sit beside her while she rested, which he was constitutionally unsuited to doing himself, and therefore found very challenging and very important. The baby came in September of 1885, a girl born safely after a long labor that tested everyone's nerves, and they named her Ellen for Micah's mother. She was small and loud, and from her first hour had the disposition of someone who was entirely confident in her own importance, which, given that she had 3 people utterly devoted to her convenience from the moment she arrived, was perhaps not surprising. Maria recovered fully, which had not been certain, and which she did with the same purposeful determination she had applied to everything for the past 7 years. Micah spent those recovery months being exactly what he had promised, present and practical, and treating her as his partner, not his patient, even when it was difficult. There was one night in October when she had been unusually tired and had snapped at him over something that did not deserve it, and he had simply absorbed it without either wounded pride or excessive understanding. And later that evening, when she had apologized, he had said, "You don't need to apologize for being human," which was the most useful thing anyone had ever said to her about the aftermath of a hard thing. By 1887, Thomas was 17 and beginning to think seriously about his future. He had been in conversation with Micah about the possibility of formal education, which was a thing that was becoming more accessible than it had been in the earlier part of the decade. There were colleges in Texas now, institutions that were building something in the frontier states. Micah was the one who brought it up because Micah had been thinking about it longer than Thomas had. "You have the capacity for more formal learning than what we can provide here," he told Thomas one evening. "That's not a criticism of what we've done, but there are things that you could learn, engineering, law, agricultural science, that would serve you and this land for the rest of your life." "You're saying I should go away to school," Thomas said. "I'm saying you should think about it," Micah said, "and that whatever you decide, we will support it completely." Thomas thought about it for several months, which was the appropriate amount of thinking for a decision of that size. He talked to his mother, who was direct about the fact that she wanted him to go if he wanted to go, that she would not hold him from his own future out of her need for him near. He talked to Micah again, late-night conversations over the kitchen table that ranged from the practical to the philosophical. He decided to go. He was accepted to Texas A&M, which had been established in 1876 and had developed a rigorous agriculture and engineering program, and which was the obvious choice for a young man whose entire life had been the practice of those things. The day Thomas left for College Station was a day that asked everything of everyone. Maria held together completely until the wagon turned at the end of the lane, and then she did not hold together, and Micah was there, his arm around her, steady as he always was, while Ellen, 2 years old and entirely confused by the emotional temperature, pulled at both their hands and demanded explanation. James, who was 7, cried openly and without any attempt to manage it, and then announced that Thomas would be back. That was just how it was, and marched back into the house to do the chores that were now his by inheritance. Thomas wrote every week. His letters were long and detailed and occasionally philosophical, the product of a mind that had been prepared to learn and was now encountering formal ideas for the first time and finding them both new and familiar, because Micah had been laying the conceptual foundations for years. Micah wrote back. Maria wrote back. James dictated letters that Thomas found hilarious. Ellen drew pictures that went into envelopes. It was not a separation, they discovered. It was the beginning of a different kind of closeness. In 1888, the homestead was unrecognizable from what it had been a decade before. The original 400 acres had grown to over 500 with the neighboring purchase. The cattle herd was profitable and well managed. The cotton yield was among the highest in the county, a result of the irrigation improvements and the soil management practices Micah had introduced and refined over the years. They employed 2 hands permanently and added seasonal help for the heavy periods. The house itself had been expanded twice, first in 1882 when James outgrew the small addition off the main room, and again in 1886 when Ellen arrived, and it was now a real house, substantial and well-made, with a porch that ran the full front face and glass in all the windows and a kitchen that was a proper working space. Micah had built most of it himself, with Thomas's help in the earlier phases and James's enthusiastic, if chaotic, assistance in the later ones. He built with the same precision and intention he brought to everything, and Maria had stood in the expanded kitchen on the day it was finished and looked at what he had made and thought of the fence post, the very first thing he had fixed, and felt the line between that moment and this one with complete clarity. There were ordinary difficulties. There were the years when the cotton price was poor, and they had to be careful with every dollar. There were disagreements, because 2 strong-minded people living and working together in close quarters would always have disagreements, and Maria and Micah were both decisive and confident in their views. The disagreements were real, and sometimes they were sharp, but they were never directed at each other personally. They were always about the thing, the decision, the approach, and they always ended with resolution. Sometimes her way, sometimes his, sometimes a third way that neither of them had thought of alone. Ellen grew into a child of formidable intellect and even more formidable will, which Micah navigated with a patience that Maria found both impressive and occasionally amusing. Ellen had opinions about everything, which she expressed with complete confidence, and what Micah had learned with Thomas about teaching an intense, interior child he now applied in entirely different ways to a child who was exterior and combative and needed someone who would engage with her arguments rather than dismiss them. "She is going to be extraordinary," Micah told Maria when Ellen was 5, and had just won an argument about the proper allocation of chicken feed through sheer logical persistence. "She is going to be exhausting," Maria said. "Both," Micah agreed. James at 9 was everything he had been at 4, only taller and more capable and still essentially a force of nature that moved through the world with irrepressible momentum. He had taken on the cattle management as his domain with the enthusiasm he applied to everything he decided was his, and the hands knew to check with James before changing anything about the herd routine, because James had opinions and facts behind them. Thomas came home from College Station for holidays and the summers of his 2nd and 3rd years, and each time he came back he was recognizably himself and also more, the accumulation of formal knowledge layered over the practical foundation, and the combination was remarkable. He had ideas about the land, the irrigation design, about the market possibilities for what they were growing, and Micah engaged with all of it seriously, implemented some of it immediately, tested some of it carefully. In 1890, Thomas graduated and came home, not to stay permanently but to make his plans. He had an offer from a surveying company in Austin, which was a real opportunity and which Maria and Micah both encouraged completely. But before he left, he sat with Micah on the porch in the evening the way they had always talked, and he said something that had been sitting in him for a while. "I want to say something," Thomas said. "Say it," Micah said. Everything that I am that is worth anything, Thomas said, comes from two people. My mother, who never let me believe I was anything less than capable, and you, who taught me what capable actually means in practice. Micah was quiet. I know you came to us because you were lost, Thomas said. I know that's where you were when you came through our gate. And I want you to know that I think about Samuel sometimes, the little brother I never met, and I think he would have been lucky to have you. And I know I am lucky to have had you. And I don't know how else to say that. Micah looked at his stepson, 20 years old and going into the world with everything he needed, and what he felt was too full for words, so he did not try to put it in them. He put his hand on Thomas's shoulder, firmly, the way you hold onto something real. Samuel would have loved you, he said, and so do I. Thomas nodded briefly and then cleared his throat because he was 20 and the moment was very large. I'll write, he said. You'll write every week, Micah said, or your mother will find you. Thomas laughed and the tension broke, and they sat there on the porch in the August evening as the fireflies began and the land settled into dark around them. That night, after Thomas had gone to bed and James had gone to bed and Ellen had been finally convinced to go to bed, Maria and Micah sat on the porch in the dark, their customary place for the important conversations, and also for the ones that needed no conversation at all. You did something extraordinary with that boy, Maria said. We both did, Micah said. You did something I couldn't, she said with the honesty that was always between them. I could love him and feed him and keep him safe, but what you taught him, the way you stood in front of him and gave him a model for how a man moves through the world, that was yours. Micah was quiet for a moment. He was ready for it, he said. From the first day, he just needed someone to meet him where he was. The fence post, Maria said. He smiled. She could hear it in the dark. The fence post, he agreed. She leaned against his shoulder, which was a thing she had done for 12 years now and which still had the same quality of relief, of rightness. I'm glad you came through that gate, she said. He turned and pressed his lips to her hair. Maria, he said, there is not a single element of my life that I would trade for anything in the known world. She believed him. She believed him with the complete and absolute certainty that she had assembled, piece by piece, evidence by evidence, over 12 years of watching a man be exactly who he said he was, over and over in the large moments and the small ones, in the difficult ones and the easy ones, in the dark and the daylight. The stars were their companions, enormous and brilliant above the flat Texas land, above the homestead that had been rebuilt from desperation into something solid and thriving, above the house that held their sleeping children, above the fence line that a stranger had repaired with 3 precise blows of a mallet on a summer morning in 1878. James discovered a talent for numbers in 1891 that surprised everyone except Micah, who had noticed it early and said nothing, waiting for the boy to find it himself. James at 11 was doing the homestead accounts with an accuracy and speed that was slightly uncanny, and when Micah suggested that the talent might point toward a future in commerce or banking, James responded that he intended to be a rancher, but that a rancher who understood his numbers was worth twice a rancher who didn't. That, Micah told Maria, is a thing he said himself without prompting. He gets the stubbornness from me, Maria said. The clarity is yours. It's all him, Micah said. Ellen at 6 had begun reading voraciously, working through every book in the house, and then asking with great specificity for more. And Micah had begun ordering books from a catalog in Austin, with a regularity that constituted a significant household expense that neither of them questioned. The books arrived in paper wrappings and Ellen tore into them with the same energy she brought to everything. And she and Micah had developed the habit of discussing what she read over supper, which James found mildly irritating, and which sometimes inspired him to read the same books purely in order to have opinions. In 1892, Maria's health took a sudden difficult turn, nothing like the pregnancy scare of 1885, but significant enough that the doctor in Redemption, a real doctor now that the town had grown enough to support one, recommended a period of rest, and recommended it with the seriousness of a man who was not being dramatic. It was influenza, the kind that took hold and refused to let go easily, and it kept her in bed for 3 weeks in a way that was new and frightening, because Maria Winslow had not been kept in bed by anything in her adult life. Micah ran the household. He simply did it, organizing the work among himself and James and the hands, cooking in the evenings with a competence that impressed James and enchanted Ellen, managing the routine with the same steady attention he brought to everything. He checked on Maria regularly, and without hovering, which was the precise distinction she needed, present without being oppressive. He sat with her in the evenings when the children were done and read to her from the books Ellen was currently working through, which were alternately agricultural history and an extremely dramatic serialized adventure novel, and they had opinions about both. On the worst night, when the fever was at its highest and she was not entirely coherent, she was aware of him sitting beside her in the dark, his hand over hers, and she was aware that he was not sleeping, that he was simply there, and in the hazy distance of the fever she thought that this was what it meant to be truly known by someone, that they would sit beside you in the dark when you did not know they were there and love you anyway. She recovered fully. The doctor was pleased and said so in the direct way that doctors who have survived frontier medicine learn to speak. The spring of 1893 was magnificent, as if the land itself was celebrating something. The cotton came up thick and green, the cattle were healthy, the irrigation system ran clean and true, and one morning in April Maria stood at the kitchen door with her coffee and looked out at everything and felt, with complete certainty, that this was what she had been working toward for 15 years. Not this specific morning, not this specific view, but this specific quality of feeling, that the ground was solid under her feet and the people she loved were safe and the work had been good and the future was not a threat. Micah came up behind her and looked over her shoulder at the same view. "Good morning," he said. "It is," she said, "an extremely good one." He put his hands on her shoulders and she leaned back against him, and they stood there looking at their land in the morning light, two people who had met in a moment of crisis and had built something extraordinary from that beginning. Thomas came back in the summer of 1893, now 23, with news that reorganized everything in the best possible way. He had met someone in Austin, a young woman named Clara who was the daughter of a civil engineer and who was finishing her own education at a new women's institution. He wanted to bring her to meet his family. He wrote ahead, and Maria read the letter twice and then gave it to Micah and watched his face as he read it. Micah finished reading and looked up. He was smiling the real smile. "Well," he said. "Well," Maria agreed. Clara arrived with Thomas in July and was received with the full combined force of the Barker household, which was genuinely formidable. James was determinedly evaluative in the way of an almost 14-year-old brother who took his responsibilities seriously. Ellen was openly curious and asked Clara 17 questions in the first hour, many of which were perfectly appropriate and some of which were not, and Clara answered all of them with a directness that Ellen clearly approved of. Maria liked her immediately, which was not something she had assumed would happen. Clara was sharp and warm and met the land and the work of it without any distance, walked the fields with Thomas that first morning and asked real questions about the irrigation design and was satisfied by real answers. Micah shook her hand when they met and looked at her with those steady eyes, and she met the look without flinching. And Maria, watching from the porch, thought, "Yes, that's the right person for our Thomas." That evening on the porch, with all of them gathered, and the summer dark coming down and the fireflies doing their work in the cotton, there was a moment that existed outside the ordinary. Everyone who mattered gathered in one place, the homestead humming with the particular life of a thing that had been built with care and had grown into itself. Micah was quiet for a moment in the conversation, looking around the porch at all of them, and Maria caught his eye across the lamplight, and he smiled at her with a completeness that said everything. Thomas and Clara married in Austin in the autumn of 1894, a proper ceremony in a proper church with guests who were the accumulated product of Thomas's years at College Station and his professional life in Austin. And Maria and Micah attended dressed in their best. And Micah walked beside Thomas during the ceremony with a formality and pride that was precisely what a father carries for a son on his wedding day. James, at 14, was a groomsman and performed his duties with the focused efficiency of a boy who has been taught to take a responsibility seriously and does. Ellen, at 9, had opinions about the flowers and shared them with anyone nearby. The years that followed were full in the specific way of a life that is well lived, not without difficulty, not without loss, but fundamentally aligned with itself. Thomas and Clara settled in Austin, where Thomas's surveying work expanded into engineering consultancy, and their letters came regularly and were full of the life they were building. Their first child, born in 1895, was a boy they named Micah James, which arrived as a letter that made Maria cry and made Micah go very still and then go outside and not come back for 20 minutes. When he came back, he did not explain the 20 minutes. "Micah James," Maria said. "Yes," he said. "How does that feel?" He looked at her with eyes that were full of something that had no name and needed none. "It feels like the thing that comes after you thought you were done feeling things," he said. She went to him and put her arms around him and held on, and he held her back, and they stood in the kitchen in 1895 with the spring light coming through the windows and the sound of James and Ellen in argument somewhere outside, and everything was, by any measure that mattered, exactly right. James took over the operational management of the homestead in 1898, at 18, with a competence that was beyond his years and a confidence that came from having been given real responsibility since he was old enough to learn. He did not displace anyone. He built on what was there, the way he had been taught, understanding the structure that Micah had designed and the vision that Maria had always held, and extending both forward. Ellen left for school in 1897, for a women's college in San Antonio that had been Micah's discovery and her own fierce campaign, because Ellen at 12 had announced her intention to be formally educated with the same certainty that she announced everything, and had spent the following 5 years preparing for it. And at 17, she left with a trunk full of books and a mind ready to be unleashed on formal learning. Her letters were epic. They ran to 15 pages and covered everything from her coursework to her opinions about the other students to her developing thoughts on the future of women in public life, and Micah read every page with the same serious engagement he had given her arguments since she was 5. "She is going to change something," he said once, folding a particularly lengthy letter. "She is going to change several things," Maria said. "God help them." In 1900, the new century arrived, and the world that Thomas and Ellen were moving into was a different world than the one Maria and Micah had navigated in 1878. The railroad came through Redemption in 1899, connecting the county to markets in a way that transformed what the homestead could do, and James had been positioned for exactly this. His understanding of the cattle market and the cotton price, and the logistics of both, meaning that the transition year was profitable in ways that had not been possible before. Maria and Micah celebrated their 22nd wedding anniversary in December of 1900, with Thomas and Clara and their 2 children visiting from Austin, and James home from wherever the cattle business had taken him that week, and Ellen back from San Antonio with her 2nd year of college behind her. The house was full and loud and warm, and Maria had cooked for days, the kind of cooking that was itself an act of love, and they sat at the expanded table and ate and talked and argued about things that didn't matter and agreed about things that did. After supper, with the children put to bed and the evening winding down, Thomas said something to the room that silenced it briefly. "I want to say something," he said, and the adults around the table attended because Thomas had always used those words only when he meant them. He looked at Micah. "When you came through our gate in 1878, he said, "I was 8 years old and I was angry at everything, and I didn't know what I was angry about. And you sat down next to me and you said you would teach me everything a man should know how to do. And you did, every single thing. Not just the fence post, not just the irrigation and the cattle and the accounts. You taught me how to be in the world, how to be someone that other people can rely on." The room was very quiet. "I know you had Samuel," Thomas said, "and I know that the love you have for him is something that never goes away and shouldn't. And I want you to know that I have always felt the blessing of having been the boy who was there when you needed to give that kind of love again. That I got to be that boy is the most important thing about me." Micah did not speak for a long moment. When he did, he said, "Thomas, everything you have and everything you are was already in you. I just saw it and stood beside it." Thomas shook his head. "You did more than that." "So did you," Micah said. Maria was looking at the two of them across the table. The man she had fallen in love with over the course of 4 months in 1878, and the boy who had been the reason it was possible. And she thought that there were some things in life that could not be explained or anticipated or deserved. Things that simply arrived, like a drifter at a gate on a summer morning, and that the only thing you could do for them was recognize them and not turn them away. She reached over and put her hand over Micah's on the table. He looked at her. 34 years before, he had put a fence post in the ground and turned to an 8-year-old boy and said words that had started everything. He had come to a gate with nothing but bedroll and steady eyes and the specific emptiness of a man who had put down a darkness and had not yet found what came next. What had come next was this. This table, this family, this woman, this life. "Maria," he said. "I know," she said. He smiled, the real one, and took her hand. Outside, the Texas night was enormous and star-filled, and the land stretched out in every direction, sound and thriving in theirs. The fence lines running straight and true, the fields resting in the winter dark, the cattle settled, the house warm and full of light, everything exactly as it should be. Everything built by two people who had found each other when they both had nothing left to lose and had chosen, with full knowledge of what choosing cost, to begin again. James put more wood on the fire. Ellen started an argument about something, which was how she started most things. Thomas's youngest had woken from sleep and was being settled by Clara in the back room, and the small sounds of a child being comforted moved through the house like music. Micah Barker sat at the table of his life with his wife's hand in his and did not want to be anywhere else in the world. He had come to this gate with nothing. He had built everything. He had been taught, perhaps, as much as he had taught, because this was the truth that the best teachers understood. That the student gives back as much as the teacher gives, that Thomas had taught him how to love again, that James had taught him that joy was not gone from the world, that Ellen had taught him that an argument could be a form of devotion, that Maria had taught him that the best thing that can happen to a man who has put down his darkness is to walk through a gate and find a woman who is not asking him to pretend it never existed. She was asking him only to be here. And here was where he had always, finally been.